Hey everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be telling you all about the books that I read in November. As ever, if you have any thoughts about any of the books that I mention in this video, do leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you thought of the book, if you're interested in reading it. Any thoughts you've got, leave them down below. I had a pretty good reading month in November. I managed to read 12 books and a lot of them were books that I really loved. I've got some fiction, I've got some poetry, and also notably I've got quite a bit of non-fiction because I participated in non-fiction November. So I'm going to kick things off by starting with my non-fiction November books, the first of which is The Book of Forgotten Authors by Christopher Fowler, and this fulfilled the Wonder Challenge for Non-Fiction November. So this book is made up of a number of small sections which bring to your attention authors that have been forgotten throughout history. Their work and their fame has sort of faded into obscurity. There were a couple of names that I had already heard of, a couple of authors whose books I had already sampled, but the vast majority of these authors I had never heard of before. I did tab a few of them that I was particularly interested in learning more about. This is such a digestible book in the sections are very short. In between every, I would say maybe like 8 or 9 authors, there is a small essay on a related topic. Overall, I thought it was a really enjoyable and informative book. However, what I will say is that it's a very white book. I do think the author made a real mistake in not including more people of colour in this book, because the reasons that authors of colour are often forgotten is definitely to do with racial elements. And I think it's important that we bring those names back into focus. So that was something that I thought could have been done better with this book, but overall I really enjoyed it. The second non-fiction book I'm going to talk about is Eat Up by Ruby Tando. I enjoyed this book so much. You may be familiar with the name Ruby Tando as she was a finalist on the Great British Bake Off a few years ago, and this is a book all about food. But it's not a book about fad diets or how to be the healthiest person possible. It's not a book about losing weight. It's a book that will make you fall in love with food again. This book celebrates cream eggs as seasonal eating, and it celebrates that amazing feeling of like when you lick crisp dust off your fingers. There are simple, healthy foods in this, and there are some sections that are recipes, but they feel like less like recipes and more like your mate just telling you how they cooked that thing that you really like. There are healthier foods discussed in this book, but there's equally, Ruby shows the value in having a takeaway or McDonald's. She talks about Weatherspoons and she talks about a microwavable shepherd's pie. As someone who can slightly struggle with their relationship with food, I really enjoyed this one and thought it was super valuable. And she also really intelligently looks at the depictions of food in literature and history and art. This is just a fantastic book and I would really recommend it to anyone. The next book I read was Eat, Sweat, Play by Anna Kessel, and this fulfilled the past time prompt for Nonfiction November, and this is definitely one of my favourite books that I've read all year. I enjoyed it so much. Unfortunately, I read it as an ebook and I would really like to get my hands on a physical copy and reread it because there was so much in it that I wanted to put a little sticky tab in or highlight. I just found so much of value in this book. So this non-fiction book is all about women's relationships with sport. She looks at how we as a society treat boys and girls differently when it comes to teaching them sport as children. It looks at the factors that go into why so many girls stop doing sport when they become a teenager. It looks at how female athletes are treated in the media and why their sports have so much less funding than their male counterparts. It looks at the impact of periods and pregnancy on the careers of female athletes. This book is just so intelligent. It's so thoroughly researched. It's fantastic, and I went into this book thinking that I knew a lot about the topic, but I learned so much more. If you are someone who is generally interested in sport, not only as a physical activity, but also as a business, then I would really recommend this book. But again, especially if you are a woman, I think you would get a huge amount of value out of this. One thing that I particularly enjoyed about it was its it's encouragement that it's never too late to get back into sport. I used to be like a really sporty kid, and like many women, I stopped doing it when I was a teenager, and I recently got back into it, and it's been one of the best things that I've ever done. And if that's something that you are thinking about doing, I would highly recommend this book as the push to do it, or a little pep talk. As I said, so fantastically researched. It's a phenomenal book, and it's one of my favourite reads of the year. The final book that I picked up specifically for Nonfiction November was More Weird Things Customers Say in Bookshops by Jen Campbell, and this fulfilled the shelf prompt for Nonfiction November. This is just a really fun mosaic of funny quotes or incidents that the author and various other booksellers have overheard or encountered during their careers. You overhear so many strange and wonderful things while working in a bookshop. I know that firsthand as a bookseller. I think if you are someone who just enjoys books, if you are someone who's worked in retail, or the combination of the two and have worked as a bookseller, I think you will find this one very, very entertaining. I think it makes a great little gift coming up to Christmas time as well, this and its predecessor, Weird Things Customers Say in Bookshops. Another book that I read in November that has to do with book selling is The Diary of a Bookseller by Sean Bethnal. This is a fantastic book. So this is the diary entries of a bookshop owner up in Wigtown in Scotland, which is Scotland's like book town. So this is the author chronicling the day-to-day goings on of the bookshop. Like More Weird Things Customers Say in Bookshops, you do get the eccentric characters that are quite entertaining, the amusing anecdotes and things you overhear. What's really interesting as well is that Jen pops up in the Diary of the Bookseller, both as a bookseller and as an author. So for that reason, I think they are books that would be really great to read close together like I did. But there's also a more serious side to this book, in that it looks at the business side of owning a bookshop and the staggering impacts of online retailers on the lives of independent booksellers. I think if you are someone who's interested in the publishing industry and more generally the bookish industry, then you would find a huge amount of value in this. Again, I went into it as someone who is quite well educated and versed in this topic, but I was learning more and more from this book. I'm actually doing an assignment at the moment as part of my publishing MA on why publishers still value bookshops, and there is a lot of valuable information in that book, or just things for me to think about. Side note, I am going to be doing a video all about my experiences so far in doing a publishing MA. I am quite scarily halfway through my master's now, so if you have any questions about what that experience has been like, do leave them down below in the comments or send me a little message on Instagram. But yeah, anyway, I would highly recommend this book. It is absolutely fantastic, and I'd like to thank my friend Ollie for lending it to me. I have one other non-fiction book, although it's a non-fiction like kids book. I read the Georgia O'Keeffe edition of the Little People Big Dreams series, and again this was one that I read on ebook as well. I read a few of these books throughout the year, and they are just wonderful children's stories about significant women throughout history. They are beautifully illustrated. The stories of these women are simplified for a child audience without taking any of the interesting or sometimes difficult topics out, which I think is really respectful to a child's intelligence. The books from this series I had read before. I knew quite a bit about the women that I was reading about, whereas I don't know anything about art. I don't know anything about Georgia O'Keeffe. I didn't really know who she was. She was a phenomenal, groundbreaking American artist. And again, this is another book that I think would make a fantastic gift around Christmas time. Another children's book that I read in November was The Grim Grotto by Lemony Snicket. This is the 11th book in a series of unfortunate events. I started rereading these books quite a while ago. It was back when it was first announced that Netflix were going to adapt it into a TV show, and I've had quite a significant break since the last time I read one of these books, and I think that break was a really good thing, because if you know anything about this series, you know that essentially each book is the same plot, changed a little bit with different characters, but essentially it's the same thing repeated. The 11th installment of the Baudelaire Orphans story they find themselves in a submarine, surrounded by quite eccentric characters, some that refuse to listen to the Baudelaires when they give very sensible information. They are trying to get away from Count Olaf, who desperately wants to get his hands on their fortune, and the Baudelaire orphans are finding out more and more about what exactly happened to their parents before they died, what exactly was the secret life that their parents led. And yeah, I can't really say much more about the plot other than that. What I really love about A Series of Unfortunate Events is the writing style. I love Lemony Snicket's voice. I think it's just such an entertaining book. I love how Lemony Snicket is himself a character in these books, and I always feel like I'm in on a little secret whenever anything to do with the Snicket family is mentioned. I find these books really comforting because they've got that repetitive storyline, but also because I'm so familiar with the Baudelaire story. I find them really comforting reads, and I really, really enjoy them. Okay, on to the adult fiction that I read in November. I read Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. Somehow, since this book came out, since the film came out, I have managed to avoid all spoilers for this book, and I'm really glad that I did manage to avoid those spoilers. I have mixed feelings on the book itself. So the basic premise of this book, I'm sure I'm the only person that hasn't read this book yet, so you probably know, but this follows the relationship between Nick and Amy, who have been married for 5 years. On their 5th anniversary, Amy disappears, and the police suspect Nick has something to do with it. We get Nick's narration, but we also get diary entries from Amy. Okay, I'm gonna start with what I didn't like about this book first. Okay, first of all, Nick and Amy are both horrible, horrible people, and it seems like my experience with reading thrillers so far is that it's just like annoying, privileged, rich people creating their own problems and being horrible people throughout the whole book. They both do so many things that I find infuriating, and I don't have a problem with there being unlikable characters per se. In fact, I normally quite enjoy disliking a character, but I don't want a character to like annoy me to the point where I can physically feel myself being annoyed. Another thing that I didn't particularly enjoy about this book was the fact that none of the plot twists surprised me at all. And like, obviously I can't tell you guys what they are, just in case you are one of the few people that hasn't read this book yet, but I just found them really obvious. What I did enjoy about this book was that I was very impressed with how the author managed to capture the voices of all the characters in this book. I thought that was done really, really well. And I think she did something fantastic in that even though these characters were super infuriating, they both had moments where you understood where they were coming from, and they said things that made sense and things that I could sympathize with. The cool girl section of this book and also of the film is quite famous, and I can see why. It was definitely my favorite passage of the book. I think the author captured a lot of quite subtle observations about human nature and human relationships. I was actually pretty impressed with this book, even though the plot itself wasn't quite for me, and I would like to read more of this author's work to see if I enjoy some of her other books a bit more. Up next we have Mr. Fox by Helen Oyeyemi. This is a piece of metafiction, and like a lot of metafiction I've read in my life, I had a good time, but I wasn't always sure what was going on. This is about the relationship, I guess you can say, between an author who is named Mr. Fox and his muse, his fictional character, his creation, Mary Fox, with an E on the end. There are a lot of stories within stories in this book, and I think they were all really well crafted, some that I thought fit the narrative more than others. And because there are all these different stories in there, it's difficult to give a plot synopsis per se. Kind of one of those books that you just have to let it take you. Like me, you may not always be sure where you're going or what's going on, but that's fine. I think it's really impressive how the author handled all these different characters that crop up in this story. I think she's a really multifaceted writer, which is something that I really appreciated seeing. If you are a fan of very literary fairy retellings, then I think you would absolutely love this book. But yeah, that's what I would say, is that it is quite literary, but also very, very enjoyable. And then finally, I'm going to tell you about the poetry books that I read in November, starting with Melissa Lee Houghton's Sunshine. This was one of my most anticipated reads for the end of the year, and it did not disappoint. Sunshine is a fantastic poetry collection, but it may not be for those of you who are easily shocked or don't like reading things that are quite explicitly sexual. But I don't have those problems, and I really enjoyed this book. Social observations in this, it can be quite dark at points. There are themes of abuse, addiction, and mental health, so be aware of all of those things if you are interested in going into this one. But this collection has such a sense of immediacy, is that a word? And urgency. It felt very much like the poet had to get these things out of her system and onto the page, while the poems are still incredibly crafted as well. A lot of the poems are quite long as well, which isn't something that I normally enjoy. I do really like me a short and snappy poem, but I have found myself really enjoying the longer ones in here. Some of my favourites were Beautiful Bodies, Mad Girl in Love, and I also enjoyed I Am Very Precious as well. Overall, this is one that I would definitely recommend. I also read some children's poetry. I read Hopscotch in the Sky by Lucinda Jacob and illustrated by Lauren O'Neill. This is a really fun collection of children's poetry that takes you through the seasons. As an adult reader, it definitely took me back to my childhood and those little things, those little moments that you can recollect that bring you right back to your childhood. It's beautifully illustrated and the colours used are amazing. It really captures the curiosities and simple joys of childhood. So like I said, I really enjoyed this one as an adult reader, but of course this collection is meant for children, and I think this would be a fantastic way of getting a child into poetry, which I think is super important. The final poetry collection, and in fact the final book I'm going to tell you about that I read in November, was She Must Be Mad by Charlie Cox. This is probably my favourite poetry collection of the year. I loved it. If you, like me, really enjoy Tumblr poetry because of the emotion that it evokes and the way it connects to your personal life, but you find it a little bit frustrating for the lack of traditional poetic technique, read this one, because this collection marries those things together beautifully. It's a lot to do with relationships in this, not just romantic relationships, although they do feature significantly. There's also friendships and your relationship with yourself. There's quite a bit to do with female sexuality in here. There are a lot of poems about mental health, and one of my favourite poems in the collection was called All I Wanted Was Some Toast, which I think it captures anxiety and depression really, really well. There are definitely lots of humorous observations in this collection as well. Style magazine has called this social media's answer to Carol Ann Duffy, but I think for me this collection reminds me slightly more of Wendy Cope. But you know, all fantastic women. There's another poem in this called Kindness, which if you've ever been through a particularly tough time and your friends have held you up and helped you through that time, I think you will find that poem very touching. It definitely reminded me of some very important people in my life. So yeah, they are all the books that I read in November. As I said, do let me know down below if you have any thoughts on these, if you've read any of them, if you're interested in reading any of them, and also if you have any questions about what it has been like doing a publishing master's thus far, leave your questions down below or send them to me on Instagram. It is wild to think this is my penultimate wrap up of the year. What a year it's been, eh? Anyways, I hope you guys are all doing well, and I will talk to you in my next video.